again, watch the videos as previously described. Okay, so without further ado, why don't we proceed with chapter 1, and let me just call up my screen. Okay, very good. So let me go here. And... All right, gang. So chapter 1, the science of psychology. The, I think first thing to really understand about psychology is that it's a science. Yeah. And well, what do we mean by science? Okay, well, let's talk about that. Alrighty. This is, well, let's get right to the definition of psychology and as a science. It's a science, it's the first word, of behavior and mental processes. Yeah. So for psychology, we're concerned both with behavior in general, animal and human. Yeah. Although a lot of what makes up psychology is still majorities of human behavior, but certainly animal behavior as well. All right, so you can think of it as living behavior. Yeah, we're not talking about the actions of atomic structures or molecules, but we're concerned about the behavior of organisms. Yeah, not molecular, but or cellular organisms, but animals and human beings. All righty, so it's a science of observing, of the science of studying the behavior. But what we study includes overt behaviors like motor actions, like crying, movement, walking, gaining weight, using drugs, but also mental processes, yeah, how people think and what they're saying to themselves, and other cognitive processes like attention and concentration, and so on. Yeah. But getting to what I was mentioning right at the get-go, what's really important is to keep in mind that it is a science. And when you hear something being described as a science, like political science, chemistry as a science, you know, we typically think of chemistry, biology, and physics as sciences, but so are sociology, psychology, and political science. Yeah. Ultimately, what makes a science is its methodology. Alrighty, it's procedures, that science follows a certain way of determining the truth, so to speak. Now, what are some primary issues in psychology that come up time and time again? Yeah, well, here are some common ones, not the only ones, but some main ones, yeah, that we'll see in various issues and arenas, which are the purview of psychology. Yeah, like abnormal behavior, change over the lifespan, how we develop from infants to becoming elders. Yeah. What are some of the things we look at? We look at, first of all, stability and change. Yeah. What seems to be stable across time and what seems to change across time. Okay. But not only what is stable and what changes, but what contributes to those changes, what variables. Yeah. And they change across time, but how do they change across time? Is it a quick change, slow change, and so on? Okay. What's an example of things? Well, I ask you, what are some things in your life about yourself that have been fairly stable, that hasn't changed all that much? And what has been subject to change? Okay. Well, if you take a moment, some of the things that may occur to you that are fairly stable, yeah, one thing is your personality, whether you're an extrovert or an introvert. You know? And most research seems to show that that's fairly stable. I mean, in other words, where you can measure introversion or extroversion in infants and toddlers. And someone who's kind of an introvert as a toddler, odds are they're going to be kind of an introvert as an elder. Okay, through life, that doesn't change too much. Or same thing with being extroverted. Yeah. Things that can change is what you know, your fund of knowledge. Yeah. And so how much information you have about computers, about languages, that can change radically depending on the choices you make or environmental circumstances and other factors. Okay, so how educated one can be radically changed by exposure to resources and educational opportunities. A second recurring theme is rationality versus irrationality. In what ways are human beings rational, meaning logical, You know, they seem to collect facts, make decisions based on facts, and make decisions based on reason, some kind of thought, logical thought process that connects to each other. Yeah. Versus, to what extent are we irrational? That we don't use facts, that we don't use reason. Yeah. That we are driven primarily by the situation or by emotions. Okay. And we're going to find in this course that there are a lot of ways we're amazingly rational, and also many ways we're amazingly irrational. And maybe one of the things that might be important for us to understand is that it's not so much one is good and one is bad, but how each operates, yeah, and how they may be good and or bad. Yeah, and I think that's one of the, and I think if you pause for a moment and think about how in your life are you rational and how are you irrational, or human beings. Yeah. One example, I'm not asking you to give an answer right now because, well, we're on YouTube. But that said, you know, in romantic relationships, in what ways are we very rational? In what ways are we very irrational? I think if you pause for a moment, you come up with a lot of ways in which certainly we're irrational, right? We seem to operate from the heart, are impulsive, and so on. We might be in a relationship which doesn't make sense to anybody, right? But is there a certain logic to that sometimes? Yeah. In what ways are we in a romantic relationship and we make decisions which are very logical, that make sense? Yeah. So that's one of the things we'll kind of look at, not just romantic relationships, but generally logic versus the lack of logic or reason. Okay. Another recurring theme, not only in psychology, but in many of the sciences, is whether something is a function of nature versus nurture. Okay. That aside, this kind of theme is kind of I typed it out in a way that it's kind of a misnomer. Yeah. And that the question really isn't so much one or the other. Okay. It's really how do the two interact? Alrighty. In the vast majority of situations, that's the, do I dare say nature? The nature of this phenomenon. That it's usually some interaction of both biology and nature. Yeah. Biology, nature and the environment. Okay, biology and the environment, nature and nurture is usually an interaction of the two. Yeah, and part of the reason is that biology is always functioning within an environment, is always impacted by an environment. Yeah, we're impacted by the environment from conception. Yeah, the fetus, the embryo, from day one, we are affected by the environment. Now, the environment may change; it may be a different kind of environment, but nevertheless, it's still an environment. Yeah, so the two interact, and that's ultimately the question. Now, are some things far more affected by nature versus certainly? Yeah, like I mentioned before, sometimes based on educational opportunities or resources available, one's fund of knowledge, how much they know, how informed they are, what skills they can acquire, can be in large part affected by the environment, hugely affected by the environment. And much less so, there's people underestimate the value of genes, right? Meeting a really smart person or dating a really smart person versus nurture versus environmental circumstances, yeah, which has a huge impact. We'll get into that through the course of this semester. Okay, let's bypass some of the history stuff. Okay, and let's get into discussion. Why is there a need for psychological science? Yeah, well, some of you may be thinking, you know, I won't knock you for it. You might be thinking, who needs psychology? It's just common sense, right? What makes people depressed? What makes people use drugs and so on? I don't know if that's true. Yeah, what makes the people depressed? Is it so commonly known? Is it so obvious? Here's a question, why? Let's just say you say, oh, it's common sense that if someone who's been sexually or physically traumatized as a child, that they're going to be depressed down the road. All right? That's obvious, so obvious. It's common sense. Why do we need a science for that? Well, this is what I would challenge you with. How about those people who've had sexual or physical trauma who don't get depressed. And there are a lot of people who've had sexual physical trauma who don't experience depression down the road. Why is that the case? Yeah, we don't know. Well, we're starting to get some ideas, and that's part of what psychology is about. Is trying to understand those things we think is common sense and so obvious. Now, the thing that's tricky about quote unquote common sense is that the way you generate common sense knowledge is usually after the fact. Yeah, after you hear about event A and then you observe event B, you may make the presumption that B is due to A. Now, it may be due to A, it may not be due to A. Yeah. Just for example, with the example of depression. Yeah. We see someone depressed. We hear some bad stuff that happened before. We presume it was because of the bad stuff that happened before. It may have been. It may not have been. And again, those very same bad things happen to other people. But why are those people not depressed? Or to complicate it even further, why are those other people anxious but not depressed? Yeah, or angry and not depressed. Yeah, they're violent, but not self-injurious, for example. Yeah. But that's what common sense does. That's the error with common sense, or the limitation, is that it's after the fact. Yeah. And common sense. I mean, there's a place for common sense. There's a place for your grandma's knowledge when she told you, when you meet a young boy, a young girl, and you're dating, when you're a young boy and a young girl and you're dating, things to look out for, things to not look out for. Okay, so I'm not saying throw grandma's advice into the trash, besides the fact that she won't appreciate that. Alrighty, but you just need to understand what are the limitations of grandma's advice. Alrighty, the limitations of grandma's advice or common sense is that it's primarily descriptive. Yeah, it may describe a situation, yeah, but we really don't know what's causing or the nature, what's causing one thing to lead to another. Okay, we'll get back to cause of relationships a little later. Right. The other thing that very often occurs when we try to understand human behavior is the hindsight bias. Now, what is the hindsight bias? Okay, well, think of the old maxim, hindsight is 20/20, right? Or think of how it's easy to do Monday morning quarterbacking. Yeah, about a Sunday football game. Yeah, things after the fact, yeah, when we look back at it, yeah, we can see all the things we think we missed, or we can come up with an idea about what led to what. Okay, like I have a picture here up on the slide of 9/11, the Twin Towers getting bombarded here by the airplanes. Alrighty, and that horrible, horrible event. Now, one of the things that occurred shortly after this was a lot of discussion of why did this happen, or how, what did we miss? And one of the things that came up was how there were a couple of FBI memos that talked about uh, how some fundamentalist terrorists were learning how to fly planes. Alrighty. And then afterwards, when looking at these memos months after 9/11, it seems so obvious that that should have been a red flag, that somebody should have done something. Well, yeah, afterwards, it seems so, right? It seems like the biggest goof up you can ever think of. But, when you think back to or that time and what was occurring, right, prior to 9/11, and what was occurring in the FBI, is that they got thousands of memos of that type, right? People making bombs, people organizing, people saying they're going to do this, they're going to do that. And, after the event, right, it's easy to look back to find a memo and say, oh, well, that's the obvious thing. We should have saw that coming. Well, yes and no, maybe in some respects, but maybe in a lot of respects, right? There are a lot of other things going on that seem to be potential probable hazards that took up the resources of the FBI. All righty. We can skip this. So what characterizes scientific, what are some of the characteristics of science? Okay. When you have a scientific attitude, Yeah. And think about this the next time you see a Facebook or debate or social media debate about some kind of issue. The person who has a scientific attitude is usually thinking these two things. Yeah. First of all, what do you mean? Okay. So, for example, if someone were to say face masks don't help in preventing acquiring the coronavirus, right? Face masks are worthless. Well, someone who's thinking scientifically will, first of all, ask the question, well, what do you mean by masks? What is a mask? What kind of mask are you referring to? And what do you mean that they don't protect? Yeah, exactly what do you mean? Um, because what's really important in science is really getting down, whether it's chemistry, biology, or sociology or psychology, is exactly what is the phenomenon of interest. What are you looking at? Because what's really important, whether you're in physics, math, or sociology or political science, is your use of language. Yeah, so that we're on the same page, that we know exactly what we're talking about. Yeah, precision is important in chemistry. Precision is important in psychology. Yeah, what do you mean by domestic violence? What is a violent act? Yeah, is a violent act? Well, we certainly know pushing and shoving somebody. Yeah, but what about if you just take your finger and you poke them in the chest when you're disagreeing with them? You go, "Hey, you're wrong." Is that violent? Okay. What if you call someone a nasty name, like the B word, in a classroom or at a work setting? Yeah. And you say it angrily in their face, 2 inches from their face. Is that an act of violence? Yeah. Well, I think you're getting the idea. Yeah. Things that seem obvious in their face, on their face, may not be so obvious, right? But if you want to discuss it scientifically, you got to uh, challenge yourself and challenge others, be really clear with what they mean. Okay. The other thing, which is a clear hallmark of science, is how do people know? Yeah. Let's go back with the face mask thing. If someone were to suggest face masks are pointless or a waste of time, they don't prevent getting the coronavirus. Well, how do they know that? Yeah. And this, can apply to so many things that people debate on and have differences on. Yeah, and unless you press someone, all you know is that they're repeating some kind of punchline or soundbite that they saw on the internet. Yeah, that it wasn't based on a study that they read. Okay. Uh, Now, the other thing that characterizes scientific thinking is critical thinking. You hear that term all the time. And why do you hear that term all the time? It's because it's pretty damn important, all righty? And it's not done, and it's a hard thing to do, yeah? Many people aren't critical thinkers, okay? Don't overestimate the number of critical thinkers out there. Probably it's fair to say um, that many people aren't. You can even say most people aren't most of the time. Okay? Even scientists, right? As human beings, they're not always critical thinkers, but the more you do it, right, the better you are from a scientific standpoint. I'm not saying you're valued more as a human being or you're innately superior, but certainly as a scientist, the more you do it, right, the better, the more sciencey you are. Okay, the more of a scientist you are. And what are the things that characterize critical thinking? Alrighty, skepticism, not taking things at face value, always getting back to those original questions, right? What do you mean and how do you know? Um, the other thing about a critical thinker is that they try to ascertain what are the underlying assumptions or premises of people's arguments. Yeah. So if someone says, this coronavirus thing, we just have to get a good treatment and that'll be the end of that. Well, what's their underlying assumption? Yeah. The underlying assumption is that a treatment, yeah, a biological treatment is the only thing that you have to be concerned about to get rid of a biological problem. Is that? It certainly is helpful, right? But as we know, as we can see in now some instances of outbreaks of measles coming back again in some places, not alone, right? But the person who says, oh, don't worry about it, all we have to do is get a medication, right? The underlying assumption is that the biological treatment is the only thing that we need. Probably not. Yeah? And if you think about it further, right, what's the other thing closely related to the biological component, right, is a healthcare system that can administer that medication. So just because the medication is invested doesn't mean everyone's going to get it or get it when they should, right? But the underlying assumption when someone says that is that everyone's going to get that medication, right? Maybe the picture is a little more complex, all righty? But that's what a scientific thinker does, right? You hear something, but you also try to ascertain, either directly or just think about it, what are the underlying assumptions with someone, or premises with someone's assertion. A good scientist also looks for the evidence. Yeah. So if someone says hydrochloroquine is a treatment, all righty, what's the evidence for that? Evidence against that, right? Now, when it comes to science, whether it's a medication, a treatment for depression, and so on, okay? Science doesn't always agree, right? What you gotta do, what your job is as a scientist, as someone who's a scientist at heart, or just as a good citizen, yeah, is you wanna know what the weight of evidence seems to indicate. Now, sometimes there's 100% agreement, but that's kind of rare, all righty? In many instances, though, the weight of the evidence, right, might indicate that it might support one assertion versus another. And that's important, yeah? And then because a lot of the time science makes its assertions based on the weight of the evidence, okay? So for example, right, climate change, yeah? Is it possible to find a study that finds that human intervention has no impact on climate change? First of all, right, an assumption is that that I'm making is that climate change exists. So let's go with that for a moment, right? Can you find studies, if you go with that assumption that climate change is real, that there is climate change, right? The next one you can question is whether it's man-made or if it's a natural phenomenon based due to other factors, not due to human action. Can you find those studies? Sure you can. Are they the majority of studies? No ways, right? They are not. But can you find, certainly you can find some studies. In most cases, for most phenomena, you can find studies that say otherwise. But here's your job is to understand, okay, why do they say otherwise? And that's another kind of assumption, and I think a good one with science, is that if there's something that goes against what most of science has found, right, after decades of research, the onus is on the person saying something different to support that, right? Now, truth be told, in many instances, the person might be presenting evidence that is new, that's important, that's going to change our knowledge, right? And that's fine too. But that said, is the onus still on the minority voice that's raising something that's kind of unique or different, contrary to decades of research? Is the onus or burden of proof on them, so to speak, to support that? Yes. Okay, but if they do that, right, then you have almost, I don't want to make this sound like a court case, but you almost have a shift of burden. Wow, if you look at that one or few studies and they seem pretty sound, what does the rest of science have to do at that point, right? It will be the burden of science to like re-examine how that's the case, why that's the case, and there may be good reasons. There's probably good reasons for that. We just may not know it. Okay, and good scientists also don't oversimplify and avoid generalizing or making broad generalizations. Alrighty. So what would be an example of not oversimplifying? Let's just say you have a treatment for depression, right? You find that by talk therapy in 3 months, you can have a significant decrease in depressive symptoms. And that's true. Most of the research supports that psychotherapy, and particularly psychotherapy and medication, yeah, can be incredibly effective in decreasing depressive symptoms. Now, does that mean it's going to decrease it for everybody? No. It won't. But then the scientific question is why? Okay, and what's the evidence for that? Right, and you can see there is evidence for that, that it doesn't help everybody. Okay, but then that's now the challenge. Why is that the case? Alrighty, so you don't want to overgeneralize a finding about psychotherapy and depression. Alrighty, um, so I'm sorry. That's probably a better example of not generalizing. Yeah, that you have certain principles which might be applicable in most cases, but don't assume that it's going to be in all cases. Alrighty. Now getting back with what we started with, the scientific method. Okay, and let me just kind of pause things for a moment. Okay. Hi, everybody. Just had to grab a quick drink. Um, and Red Bull, by the way. So let's talk about the scientific method, which we mentioned earlier. This is probably the quintessential characteristic of a science. It's methodology. Okay. And what is a scientific method? Well, it is a procedure, a group of procedures for collecting information and making sense of that information. Now, part of that process involves working from a theory. Okay, and what is a theory? Okay, now you hear a lot of uses of theory, and again, you kind of want to ask somebody if they're saying there's a theory, what do they mean by that? Okay, a lot of the time, colloquially, commonly, right, in public general use, a theory is more of a hypothesis or question. That's how most people are using it. When scientists talk about a theory, they're talking about an explanation or framework for understanding phenomena that's supported by evidence. Okay, so like the theory of evolution. That's not a question. Okay, that's a framework for understanding a lot of phenomena, right? Besides just species and how they change over time. Okay, and so it's an understood way of understanding a phenomenon. Okay, phenomenon or various phenomena. Alrighty, theory of general relativity, right, is another one. Is a framework for for how we understand how the planets move and the universe expands and all that kind of good stuff. Alrighty, it's not a question. It's not just an idea I might have, which might be right or wrong. Alrighty. So if you hear someone say, well, evolution theory is just a theory, they're probably thinking of it colloquially like a question, kind of a maybe, right? I have a theory of this, right? That's how people say when they're trying to pontificate on why they think something's happening at work. Here's my theory. It's more, here's my idea, here's my speculation. When scientists use the word theory, they're talking about a framework for how to understand reality that's based on evidence. Now, that doesn't mean a theory isn't subject to modification or change. Yeah, Isaac Newton's theory of, uh, of the relation among the planets has been subject to, great revision, right? I mean, there's still many of his ideas we still use, but in terms of his understanding of how the planets interacted was subject to change based on subsequent evidence, right? Which is what a good scientist does. She or he will have a certain framework, but will be open to revising that framework, yeah, if there's contrary evidence, which happens all the time. Yeah. And why does that happen all the time? Well, part of the reason sometimes we weren't very good scientists initially, or sometimes we're doing it right. We established a good framework, but then better methods for collecting data or analyzing data came about. Yeah, a lot of science changes because we can see things better. Yeah, either seeing things in outer space, seeing stars that we never saw before, galaxies, or seeing atomic particles, quantum particles that we never saw before. Okay. or with human behavior, being able to, let's say, videotape a couple arguing and then dissecting their interactions, how they look at each other, how they raise their voice, the words they use, and breaking it into sub clips, sub little mini clips that might last a duration of seconds, if not partial periods of time. Yeah. Um, and which allows us to analyze their behavior because now we can see their interactions better. Alrighty, and the way things work, well, I won't talk about observation theory, we've kind of touched on that, but just keep in mind that the nature of science very often follows subpoint B. Someone has an observation, they develop a way of understanding things, and based on their theory of some of the theories I just mentioned, will generate hypotheses, right? And a hypothesis is you're making a prediction, yeah? You're saying if one thing happens, it's going to affect other things, yeah? If A is present, B is going to happen, alrighty? And based on our collecting data, that'll help us they'll either support, not support, or revise our theory. Another thing that's very important with the scientific method is the idea of operational definitions. And an operational definition is really simply a very specific, crystal clear definition of what you're talking about. Yeah. Now, why do you want that? Yeah. Because it will allow other scientists, right, to do studies to examine and see if they find what you found. Alrighty. So if you find that drug A decreases depressive symptoms, yeah, you need to operationalize what you mean by depression, yeah, which may seem obvious, but it can be quite complex depending on what you're investigating, yeah. So for example, with depression, you might want to say the presence of sad mood characterized by crying, decreased energy, um, um, let's see, decrease changes in eating and sleeping behavior for at least a 2-week period, yeah, with no break during that 2-week period. And that's very specific, right? That's pretty crystal clear that if someone is experiencing those several things every day, throughout the day for a 2-week period, they're probably depressed, right? And if your drug changed that circumstance, right, then another scientist can say, oh, wow, she or he really investigated depression because that's clearly depression, or I can agree that that's depression. I might have a slightly different definition, but I see their definition. You know, whereas if the scientist was kind of vague about it, saying I gave this drug to a bunch of depressed people, you should be asking as a scientist, what do you mean by that? What's depressed? Yeah. Is it just a casual colloquial use of the term depressed, or do you mean a clinical definition, which is kind of similar to what I just described? Okay, we'll skip that. Now, what are the objectives of psychological scientific? What are psychological scientific objectives? We touched on these, but these are the 4 main things to describe a situation. Alrighty. So maybe it's domestic violence. You might want to describe how couples interact they're in a relationship with domestic violence. Prediction. You might want to predict who is likely to get into a relationship with domestic violence. One predictor may be someone who's experienced physical violence in their families. Yeah, there's some research to support that. You know, people who've been victims of childhood physical abuse or observed domestic violence they have an increased risk of being in those kinds of relationships. Now, the other is to explain. Yeah. So what are some of the causative factors for domestic violence? Okay. And we'll try to flesh that out a little further, what we mean by a causative factor. And finally, control. Okay. So if we can describe a situation, make predictions, and then understand some of the things that cause domestic violence, this will allow us to control domestic violence. Yeah, probably not absolutely, but that goes with most things in life. Yeah, but control is far better than we did before. Alrighty. So that's the idea. Yeah? So it's either maybe controlling a disease, controlling a psychiatric situation, yeah, controlling, or for psychology, controlling changing human behavior. Yeah. Now, let's talk about the main research designs. And the three main ones I'm going to be talking about are descriptive, correlational, and experimental. Now, the first type of design are descriptive designs. Now, what descriptive designs do, as the term kind of connotes here, is that they describe a phenomenon. They help us understand what's going on. Okay, let's just say with child abuse. Okay, let's get a good description of what happens with parents. What are parents doing? What are children doing? Okay, that is involved in this situation of childhood physical abuse. Now, there are different ways of doing this. One way is by way of your case study. Yeah, so someone might have in their individual therapy practice a client who's been a victim of physical abuse, right, from the parents, and the clinician might talk about that, right? Might talk about how long it occurred, when it occurs, how it occurs, and so on. Now, is that valuable information? It certainly can be. Alrighty, it depends, right? Depends on how that case study was done. How did the psychologist collect the information? Okay. One of the things you want to look out for, we'll touch on during this course is, was there bias? Yeah, did the psychologist look for certain information he or she wanted to confirm their own theories, but not consider other evidence? Okay, so the limitation with a case study is that what the person may be talking about, related to what I just described, may be an atypical situation or unique circumstance. And science is concerned about trying to find things that apply, not to overgeneralize, but to find general principles. Yeah, you want to find a medication that generally works, right? There's obviously going to be exceptions. You should know that when it doesn't work, right? Another way of describing a situation is by running a survey. So you could do a survey of people who've experienced childhood physical abuse. You could actually interview children, right, who've experienced that, or parents who've committed that. Yeah. Now you got to keep in mind that one of the things that a survey is always going to be limited by is the effect of wording. Alrighty, especially for something like domestic violence. Now let's switch it up to something like sexual behavior. Alrighty, and let's just say you wanted to do a study at HBU to find out the frequency of sexual intercourse among HBU students. Okay. Wow, that will be a loaded survey in many ways. But certainly one of the challenges before you, if you wanted to do such a survey, yeah, is to operationalize sexual intercourse. Okay. Now, we may all think we're on the same page as to what sexual intercourse is, but if we had a discussion about it, you'd be kind of surprised, right? And because one of the things that certainly can be up for disagreement is, what is sexual behavior? What is sexual intercourse? Okay, are you just talking about heterosexual? Very often when people describe intercourse, they describe heterosexual intercourse. Well, what about homosexual intercourse? What is that? Okay, so what is intercourse? And if you do a survey, right, if you just go up to someone and you're even assuming you guys are on the same page with what intercourse is, what period of time are you interested in studying, right? If you just go up to someone and say, how often do you have sexual intercourse? They might say, plenty, right? Good for them. But you won't know what the heck they mean by that. What would you have to do? Right? You'd probably have to set some kind of time frame. Yeah. So you might say, how often have you had sexual intercourse? Based, and you can show the person how you're defining it, or tell them, and then in a 2-week period. Okay. But that's an important kind of scientific consideration. What is your time frame? Why 2 weeks? Or should it be a week? Should it be a month or a year? Those are all the things you'd have to kind of figure out in terms of what you're going to put into your survey. Yeah, because the wording matters. It's going to affect your data. The less precise your wording, the less precise your data and the harder it is to interpret. Alrighty. The other kind of descriptive study is the naturalistic observation. Now, the naturalistic observation is where you just kind of plop yourself somewhere and observe people. Okay, sounds easy enough, but can be very complicated. Yeah, let's just say you wanted to do a study, examining assertive behavior and getting someone's phone number at a bar, right, or at a dance club. Well, how do you do that? What do you count as assertive behavior? Alrighty, is there a certain distance that the two people have to be? Do they have to be close? Um, I would say standing within a foot for you to consider one person as acting assertive. You know, how about voice volume? How about eye contact? How about how many things they say? Right. So what is assertive behavior? And you know, you might be able to come up with a good definition, but man, when you try to count that in the real world, right, which is what matters, can be very tricky, very difficult. Now, correlational studies, yeah, are studies where you collect data, yeah, and in the simplest correlational studies, you're examining 2 points of data, yeah, not in time, but 2 points of data. So, for example, you might do a study on the relationship between ice cream eating, yeah, Baskin and Robbins, ice cream eating, and violent behavior, right? So you count the number of times people eat ice cream, let's say within a 1 month period, and the number of violent felonies that occur in the city of Honolulu, okay? And you might find, and this has been found, that there is a correlation between ice cream eating, the amount of ice cream that's consumed within a city, and the amount of violent felonies. Now, you might go, hooray, I found something really kind of interesting, that the more ice cream you eat, the more violent we get. Well, you know what act you just committed, right? You committed the act of confusing correlation with causation. Just because the two are correlated, right, the more ice cream eating there is, you also see an increase in violent felonies, doesn't mean ice cream causes violent acts. It may, it's possible, but all you know is that they are co-related. Okay. Now, does that mean it's a waste of time? Hardly. Right? It's interesting information, but and also what it allows you to do is to make a prediction. So now that you have this correlational finding in Honolulu, you may be able to predict the increased amount of ice cream consumption in Houston and predict whether there's going to be an increase in violent felonies in Houston. Okay, if you did a good correlational study in Honolulu, it's going to allow you to make a prediction for what goes on in Houston. Alrighty, so that's the value of correlational studies. All right, another one is a study done by Gottman, where he filmed dozens of couples having a conversation, but he directed them to find a topic that they disagreed on. Right? So what he ended up getting loads and hours of film on was couples arguing. Okay, and couples, as you can imagine, really varied. Some could argue well, some argued poorly, right, and became very nasty with each other, and it was all caught on film. Now, what the Gottman did was he took all this video, and then he broke it up into, I think, 1 or 2 second bits. Alrighty, and he had every 1 or 2 second bit scored by his graduate students, and he scored tons of stuff. He examined things like voice volume, eye contact, who initiated, who provoked, hostility, who kind of shut down and all that, stopped talking, started playing the silent treatment, and all that kind of good stuff. And he found a number of interesting things. Yeah, one of the things that he found was that there were a number of behaviors that were correlated with couples getting divorced a year later. Yeah, one of the things that was highly correlated with what would happen a year later was, among other things, one of the things I always kind of stands out in my memory as kind of a fascinating finding was a predictor was and I think he in his initial study he mostly looked at heterosexual couples, is if the man shut down during the conversation. And so if in couples where the guy shut down more often, yeah, that behavior was correlated. Not all the couples where the guy did that ended up in divorce, but there was a significant relationship, meaning it wasn't by chance that there was some relationship between men shutting down and then divorce a year later. Okay? Now, again, that's not to say all the couples where the guy did that shut down, but there was some kind of co-relationship. Yeah? Now, does it mean that the guy shutting down caused a divorce? No, you don't have data to make that inference, that conclusion, okay? Because it's a correlational study, right? They watched couples argue, and then they got another data point, right? Divorce a year later, and then they found statistically a correlation between the two. That doesn't mean one caused the other. That being said, it is valuable information about what may be going on with couples. Okay, this kind of stuff I'll kind of bypass. I think a lot of you are probably familiar with what this means. Um, just talked about that. And I think we kind of touched on this already. Well, actually, let me briefly touch on this. But this kind of schematic kind of lays out very, I think, in a very powerful way, is the illusory correlation. Now, what is the illusory correlation? Let me just stop here for a moment. Okay, sorry about that. All righty. So, the way to understand the schematic is try to imagine think of the stereotype of a lesbian, right? A stereotype that some people hold, and I don't want to be perpetuating a stereotype, but I just want to lay out a stereotype, is that a lesbian is a woman who looks masculine. I mean, what's the stereotype, right? Leather jacket, short cropped hair, no makeup, looking very kind of like a guy, and all that kind of stuff, right? That's the stereotype people have of lesbians, right? And what people who hold that stereotype, right, are very inclined to do is to find confirmatory evidence. Yeah. So you can see if we think of the lesbian and the question of whether they're masculine or feminine, if we have this kind of stereotype, we already have this illusory correlation. We're more likely to notice, remember, talk about, imagine situations that confirm this image. Yeah. And not so much of all the lesbians we may have heard of, yeah, who are feminine, who wear dresses, makeup, have long hair, are traditionally feminine and pretty and all that kind of stuff, right? You might hear, but then of someone who fits those characteristics is a lesbian and is feminine, but the disconfirming evidence to this idea you can think of as a theory, right? We discount it, forget it, right? Don't think about it. And same thing with the non-lesbian, right? So the non-lesbian who's feminine, we remember all those instances, right? But forget the instances where there are heterosexual women who are masculine, which there are, right? Well, we may not think about that so much. Now, this relates to a stereotype about sexual orientation, but this can apply to many things. Yeah. Besides stereotypes, can apply to things such as ideas about climate change. Yeah. So we're very inclined to, if we don't think climate change is real, if we think it's a hoax, right, we'll discount the evidence contrary to our ideas, but we're more likely to find, feed, think about the evidence that supports our notion that climate change is a hoax. Okay, it's not a hoax, by the way. So finally, in the experimental design, right, this is the third time. What makes it an experiment, right? Well, an experiment is something more than just a bunch of glass tubes and a woman or a man in a white lab coat, alrighty? An experiment refers to a very specific way of collecting and understanding data, alrighty? It's a situation where you have what's referred to as an independent variable, something you're manipulating. Right? Think of a drug versus a placebo. Maybe that's the cleanest, easiest, a familiar example. Right? So you want to see if drug A works on knocking out coronavirus versus a placebo, right? Something inert, which doesn't have an active agent. Alrighty? And the dependent variable, right, is whether someone still has the coronavirus after you give them the treatment. Alrighty? So your dependent variable is the presence of coronavirus, and your independent variable is the thing you're manipulating. Now, in a true experiment, what you do is with your independent variable, right, the thing you're manipulating, is you give it to some of the subjects, but other subjects get the placebo. But whoever gets the active agent, right, the new drug, versus the placebo, you do it by what's referred to as random assignment. Okay, so you randomly decide by flip of a coin, roll of dice, a table of random numbers. It's basically a table with all these numbers randomly generated by a computer, and which determines whether someone gets the drug or they get the placebo. Alrighty. Now, what's the value of random assignment? The value of random assignment is that you made the subject's exposure or experience, right, of getting the manipulated of the independent variable, the drug, a function of chance. Okay, it wasn't due to because you just chose to give the drug to the first 50 people, but give the placebo to the next 50. Or you gave it to your friends, but you didn't give it to people you weren't as familiar with, or on the subject side, right? Subjects say, give me the drug, and other subjects, just give me the placebo. That isn't chance, right? Those are all other factors, right? Which could be confounding factors, right? Which would explain why some people had less of the coronavirus than others, right? You want the only thing different between these people, not because you're familiar with them or they came early or some demanded the drug and others said, just give me the placebo because I'm scared of the drug, it's a new drug. That the only thing that differentiates the subjects, is whether they had the drug or not, and it was due to chance. Alrighty, when that's the case, reason why I have Wendy here, I think her name's Wendy, is that it's like Wendy's magic wand. It makes all those confounding variables, right, disappear. So the only thing that differs between the subjects, is by chance. I mean, they differ in all kinds of ways, but if they differ, it's by chance. It's not like all the older guys got the drug and all the younger guys didn't get the drug, right? All the people came in early, got the drug, and all the people came in late didn't get the drug. That would be some kind of selection, alrighty? And that could be that is a confounding factor, alrighty? Because if you just gave it to the first people to come to the door, they will get the drug, and the people who come later in the day, I'll give them the placebo because they're not early risers, right? So you give all the early risers the drug. Well, if 3 months down the road, those who got the drug have a lower presence of the coronavirus, right? Is it due to the drug or the placebo? Now you'll be tempted to say, all those folks, they have a lower presence of the coronavirus. It must be because they got the drug. It may be, or it may be because they're early risers, and there's something about early risers. Maybe early risers are younger, or maybe early risers are more fit, or maybe early risers have a different diet. We don't know because it's a confound now. because you didn't do it randomly. If you do it randomly, then they're getting the drug or not getting the drug is only due to chance, right? The flip of a coin, the roll of the dice. And if that's the case, right, it's like a magic wand. It makes all the other potential confounding variables or arguments disappear like magic. And that's what makes an experiment the meat and potatoes of science. Yeah, that it allows you to make a cause and effect statement. Now you can say, if it turns out after random assignment, subjects who got the new treatment had a significant decrease in the coronavirus, you can say it's because of the drug, okay? And not because of any of the other possible counter arguments. Okay, so when you hear experiment, that's what was done, okay? Every now and then, sometimes people use the word experiment loosely and they're talking about a correlational study or some kind of descriptive study. An experiment is what we just described. Okay, and with that, I will, let's see. I'm just going to go through this very quickly. Make a point to, review the discussion on statistics, yeah, what a bar graph is, and be familiar with these different modes of central tendency. Alrighty, there is a difference between mode, mean, and median. It's kind of important to know the difference between those. There will be a discussion about what is the range of scores, what information does that tell you, what variance means, but particularly what standard deviation means. Alrighty, so make a point to read that, be familiar with that stuff. And finally, what statistical significance means. Yeah, and I'll just touch on that very briefly. Whenever you hear a study say it found statistical significance, what that means is that the finding, let's say go back to the drug treatment, right? The treatment that seems to have found over 3 months that those who got the drug had there was a significantly lower presence of coronavirus, okay? Versus those who got the placebo, right, there wasn't. Now, what are you saying there? Okay, when you say significance, you're not saying, oh, this is important. Well, it is important, but statistical significance refers to the statistical phenomenon that the differences you see between those who got the drug and those who got the placebo is not due to chance. Yeah, chance would be random. It could have happened, it didn't, or it could not have happened. Okay, we're saying when we're saying that this study is statistically significant, what it's saying is that mathematically speaking, the number of individuals, yeah, had a decrease in the presence of coronavirus to such an extent mathematically, yeah, that it wasn't a little bit less, that it was such a big difference from those who got the placebo. Yeah, the amount of coronavirus is right. It's not saying that there's no coronavirus. It's saying it decreased, but it was such a big decrease compared to the placebo people that mathematical difference between the two is so large, it's not a chance event. Yeah. So in other words, if you let's just say you got another sample people and you just gave them the placebo, just gave them the placebo. By chance, some people will have more or less coronavirus, okay? But if there was a statistically significant difference in the previous study, right, those differences are going to be small, okay, or random. Right? It's going to be up to whatever, chance events, okay? Who knows what? But in the previous study, because it was done as an experiment, so if there are significant findings, you can say it's not due to chance, and if it's an experiment, it was done, it's due to the causative factor A caused B. Okay. You can also have significant correlations. What that means, right, the other type of study, is that it means that there is something going on between ice cream eating and felonious violent behavior, okay, that they're related. Oh, by the way, I never did explain how they're related. Other studies have found what the possible third factor is, and that's the thing with correlational studies. There can always be another factor, right, which may be the causative factor. And in this case, the other third variable, okay, temperature, yeah, heat. warmer months of the season, of the summer season. Yeah. So more people eat more ice cream when it's hotter during the year. And when it's hotter, then when it's hotter during the year, what's also the case? People are out and about more. Yeah. And when people are out and about more, yeah, they're more likely to have conflict. Okay, as opposed to when it's freezing and it's winter, people tend to stay indoors more. Not to say, and it's not to say that people don't ever have physical conflicts during the winter, but it's usually much less in most places most of the time. Alrighty, so it's not ice cream eating. But because it was a statistically significant finding, there was something going on. What was going on, though, it wasn't that ice cream eating was causing um, violent felonious behavior. It was because there was another variable also correlated, right, which may explain the increase of the relationship between ice cream eating and violent felonious behavior. Okay. With that, that's all I have to say for the first third of chapter 1. Okay, we have another 2/3 of the material to go through, but we will go through that in future installments of Psych 1000 on YouTube. Alrighty, so I will post those up and let you know how to get access to retrieve those. And with that, I will see you later. Take care. Bye-bye.